So the title of my talk is Book History for the Uninitiated. That is, how can specialized knowledge be transferred to a new audience? I think the history of the book is a remarkably robust field of study in universities. I think one of the reasons for that is that we, that is book historians and bibliographers, we collectively profess a kind of complex honeycomb of specialized knowledges. And I like that metaphor of the honeycomb because everything is connected in a honeycomb, but not necessarily directly connected. In this room, I'm sure there are people who know about things like bookbinding tools and techniques, and others who can tell us about literacy and reading, or about woodblock illustration, or about intaglio printing or marginalia. Some of us need to know those things and urgently wish to convey them to others, whether in the classroom or in our publications. But others just really don't need to know them because we need to know other things. We're book historians too, but our specialized knowledge gets disregarded in turn by our colleagues. Some of us specialize in publishing history, the publishing of a single author's works, or even of a whole period of literary history. For others, it's about place. The history of the book in Mexico, the history of the book in Central America or in Canada, wherever. Some of us, of course, don't work on books at all, if that means the codex, but we work on periodicals or newspapers or broadsides or pamphlets. What we share is an understanding that the book is only a convenient, although ambiguous, abbreviation. The word tries to capture a complex conceptual category referring to objects that are both material and textual. Scholars approach that complexity from diverse disciplinary perspectives, from literature and law, from library and rare book studies, from history and politics, and from publishing and media studies. Book history, of course, is not a single discipline, and while it's certainly multidisciplinary, there's more to it than multiplication. I prefer to think of it as a complex interdiscipline. But what I want to do today is start by turning that complexity inside out and ask two questions that arise from inverting the conventional acknowledgement of interdisciplinarity. First question is, what is that knowledge that specialist book historians have in common? And secondly, can we identify what non-specialists ought to know about the history of the book? What knowledge, if any, is held collectively by people working in this disparate range of specialties and temporal periods and geographical locations? And if there's one lesson that the history of the book teaches, can it be conveyed in elementary form to non-specialists? Behind those questions, I think there lies a much bigger one, and that is, how can specialized knowledge be mobilized to reach out into everyday life, whether it's in the classroom, in the media, or in the places where cultures and ideologies come into conflict? That question, of course, touches on every discipline in the academy. But given that historians of the book are interested in both medium and message, it seems to me that we're in a strong position to intervene in some of these conversations. Now, I haven't made a survey or undertaken a proper study, but based on 30-some years of conversations with people outside the field, whether it's friends or family or random taxi drivers, my hunch is that a great deal of the so-called common knowledge about the book and its history is actually downright wrong. Much of it has been disproved quite recently by book historians' own research, but that specialized knowledge hasn't really penetrated outside of academia, and sometimes not even outside our own disciplines. So some examples of some of these myths or mistakes. The idea that ordinary, non-elite people in the past could neither read nor write. The idea that Gutenberg's career marked a turning point from medieval to modern in Europe because he invented the printing press. And as a corollary to this, places outside Europe are more or less irrelevant to the history of the book. Then there's the notion that printing somehow changed the book irrevocably, whereas older manuscript books had been subject to error, to scribal error. Print was somehow clean and could only get cleaner. Authorship, was always a matter of individual genius. Publishers are relatively insignificant in the making of books, except perhaps when they get in the way of that authorial genius. And then there's reading, the notion that the message that a modern reader takes from an old text is not only the one that the author fully intended to convey, but it's also the same message that would have been gleaned by readers contemporary to the author. And my last example, computers and digitization mean the end of the book as we know it, because like Gutenberg, Google has changed everything. And I'm sure that most people in this room have found yourselves disputing one or more of these widespread assumptions. We might guess how these old cliches got embedded in the culture, but really, why isn't that new knowledge is not being disseminated more successfully? It seems to me that if we want to know about everyday knowledge about the history of the book, we could do worse than turn to Amazon.com, the bestseller list there. The heading History of Books is a subset of booksellers and bookselling, books and reading, history and criticism, literature and fiction. And under this heading are a few of the books that cover what you and I would call book history. But I'm afraid to say that most of those respected books are a long way down the list, and others are categorized elsewhere. The list fluctuates considerably, but some of those appearing in the top 50 in August and September of this year have included A History of Reading by Alberto Manguel, the book A Global History, edited by Suarez and Woodhausen, An Introduction to Manuscript Studies by Clemens and Graham. Now, sometimes Martin Lyon's book, A History of Reading and Writing in the Western World, makes the top 50, or Andrew Pettigree's The Invention of News. I've seen a couple of Robert Darnton's books, sometimes appearing, but not consistently. Meanwhile, I have to tell you that for many weeks, the number one book on the bestseller list in this category has been The Tao of Pooh by Benjamin Hoff. That little volume is a gift book or a novelty book, a whimsical take on Buddhist practice linked to the Winnie the Pooh stories of A.A. Milne, hence The Tao of Pooh. Now, the simplest conjecture here is that the listing was a mistake, of course, the sort of thing that happens when a book doesn't fit a conventional genre. But there are plenty of other mistakes. Many of the books on the list are uncritical celebrations of literature, or of libraries, or of reading, all of them making that fundamental confusion between books as texts and books as objects, while ignoring their duality. Several are works of literary criticism that provide little or no reference to bibliographical materiality. Most titles in the top 50 are by writers who've made their mark as novelists or journalists, as non-academic authors with commercial track records. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point. It's fun to look at it. I recommend you do that if you have a few minutes. But I just want to point out that the way in which academics understand the history of the book it has not penetrated to the Amazon people, or perhaps I should say to the Amazon algorithms. Another thing, by the way, that this brief excursion into online research has shown me is that the terms book and history consistently produce ambiguous results on search engines. Wikipedia, for example, makes an interesting distinction between history of the book, which is very brief and Eurocentric, and history of books, which is much more extensive, including writing, transmission, and so forth. Sometimes the search results offer an immediate link to the idea of the death of the book, and a lot of misguided hand-wringing. But of course, that's where book historians should be at hand to offer our expertise and some comfort. We can tell people that the book changes, but it doesn't actually die as long as there are authors and publishers and readers and libraries. What I want to do today is first to tell you about my answer to that question about essential knowledge, and then to expand on it, to think about mobilizing our knowledge to reach both students in school and general readers in the popular culture. There are two key points. First, all book historians and bibliographers know that the book is mutable. Even a single text from a known author has undergone change. It has mutated, that is, it's transformed, it's got modified because of the choices that authors, publishers, readers, and others have made. That replication, another useful term, replication with variants, can happen to the text or to the material object. Usually it happens to both. A book's or a periodical's written text and its material form are subject to change before publication, between editions, through reprinting and appropriation, across translations, and through time. And those changes affect the book's meaning and actually effect the book's meaning. They make it say what it wants to say. The changes might be editorial revisions or printer's errors. They might be acts of censorship or abridgment. They could involve cover redesign, textual repurposing, or market-oriented repackaging. Often specialized knowledge and intense research are necessary in order to identify these kinds of variants, and it's all too easy to go astray. Scholars have learned that early modern printers made numerous changes as the sheets of the earliest printed books went through the hand press, so that no two copies are exactly alike. Even when printing transformed in the 19th century from a skilled craft to an industrial process, the plate or the page that resulted from the printer's labor did not achieve stability. Scholars have shown how authors and editors, as well as printers, illustrators, and their helpers left their mark on the Victorian page. And then that page traveled between the Americas, between Europe and the Americas, or Europe and the Americas and Australasia, and so forth. And every time, editors introduced their own revisions. When those texts survived into the 20th century, they went into paperback editions. And when they were eventually freed up from copyright restrictions, further editions proliferated, and publishers took a healthy profit. Moving on to digital books, these, of course, are notoriously unstable, but somehow people seem to accept the instability of digital, even when a text is relatively stable, as of course happens with a book from a reputable publishing house. Whereas the instability of printed pages is a tough lesson to learn. Perhaps the people in charge of manufacturing printed books have actually always made it their business to create a product with a kind of air of stability, to actually work to conceal its mutability. So my second point is related, and that is that the book is mediated. The agents of change are people and not technologies, men and women with human motivations, not script or print or digital media. This is the same thing as saying that books, periodicals, and ephemera are embedded in a material culture. That books, periodicals, and ephemera are embedded in a media culture. A print culture, of course, if we're talking about the last few centuries. Scholars have learned to dispute assumptions that the technology of printing acted as an agent of change. That kind of argument is known as technological determinism, suggesting a sort of inevitability in the face of progress. For robust historical analysis, however, the focus of study has to be on the people who choose whether and how to deploy the technology in ways that suit their motives, whether for profit, for art's sake, for proselytizing, or for pedagogy. Both aspects of the book, the mutability and the mediation, have been well documented by scholars in the last 30 to 40 years. Adrian Johns demonstrated that the nature of the book in early modern Europe was to shift and slip. He showed how it was the collective efforts of master printers and stationers that created a reputation for credibility and stability. But you get the same message about mediation from studies of authorship, where old myths of the solitary authorial genius have been shattered in favor of studies of collaboration with publishers, that's in happy relationships, or of textual mangling or dispersal when things don't go so well. You get it from studies of publishing in the 19th and 20th centuries, where colonial and global markets offered publishing entrepreneurs the opportunity to produce multiple versions of any given book for different sets of readers. Add periodicals to the mix, whether as the place of individual publication for many novels, or as the venue where books were excerpted and reviewed, and the complexity increases. Most of all, you get demonstration of the ways in which books shift their shape as they move through space and time, I think most of all in the history of reading. As Mary Hammond has demonstrated, the 18th century woman reader encountering Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice in 3 volumes for the first time, or rather actually not that because it was published anonymously, she had a very different experience from the male undergraduate of 2017 who settles down to read the book in a university press paperback the night before his essay is due, in a course where Austen is the central figure in the literary period known as Romanticism. So this is my answer to the question of what all book historians share. We know that the book is mutable, and we know that its variations have been mediated by human agency. Historians know it and filter their awareness through the perspective of reading and influence. Literary scholars know it, but their perspective is more likely to be authorship and composition. And bibliographers know it too, when they study the material book from the perspective of publishing and circulation. Oftentimes, the minutiae of a specific case or the passions of dispute over details tend to obscure the knowledge, and I'd say the values that we all share. So this is who I think we are, or rather what we all know. If I'm right that book historians do share this core knowledge, well, what are we supposed to do with it? Certainly we'll continue, of course, to build up the layers of detailed scholarship and continue to share it in specialized journals and at conference presentations. That goes without saying. But what does need saying, I think, is that some of us should also be mobilizing our knowledge and sharing it with that vast realm of people who don't know, let's say, how to spell codex or incunabula, who don't know the difference between edition and issue and state, or what a colonial series of novels means, or whatever speciality we're talking about. If we can start out by saying something like this, saying the history of the book is about how books are fundamentally unstable and always have been, and that book historians show how books and all forms of material media, how books got changed by the people whose job it was to compose or produce or to consume them, and why that matters. At that point, our own particular research is going to fit more smoothly into the larger framework. Then, when we, or our students, or our colleagues, have an opportunity to reach a wider audience, the specialized knowledge of our research can be kind of mobilized to explain it with clarity. And ideally, the essence of that specialized knowledge can also be mobilized in such a way as to promote skeptical readings and critical thinking. This term I've been using, knowledge mobilization, refers to moving available knowledge, often from formal research, into active use. To quote from the Canadian funding agency, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, it has to do with, quote, the production and use of research results, including knowledge synthesis, dissemination, transfer, exchange, and co-creation or co-production by researchers and knowledge users. It's meant to connect researchers with those who are knowledge brokers, things like publishers and librarians, broadcasters, and so forth, and knowledge users, which include citizens as well as students. To put it crassly, the mobilization of scholarly knowledge means making the products of research useful to the taxpayers who paid for it in the first place. Now, I don't want to claim that I've done this, or even that I know very much about how to do it. The last time I checked, the 2 best-selling of my own books on that Amazon list, they sat at a not bad number 34 for the Cambridge Companion to the History of the Book, and a quite pathetic 205 for Old Books and New Histories. And the book that I'm starting to write now will probably be another academic monograph. aimed this time at the niche market for historiography. What I'll be wanting to do is to write to persuade my fellow historians that the facts of authorship, publishing, and reading apply to history books, and that even our august discipline has been subject to the whims of the marketplace. To do this, I'll have to demonstrate that even history books are unstable, subject to revision and recasting, both in their texts and in their material form. And also that history books, especially textbooks for school children, travel across national boundaries, shifting shape as they make their way into the hands of successive populations and generations of readers. The results of this can be harmful. In particular, I'll be suggesting that narratives of local and regional histories were actually slow to emerge in the British Empire because accounts of the history of England could be more economically reproduced for the colonial market. Now, perhaps a few book historians will want to read this future book of mine too, and I certainly want to stress for their benefit that it isn't only works of creative literature or of scientific knowledge that yield results when subjected to our methodologies, but history works for that as well. But any study that aims to convince those two tough audiences, historiography and book history, hasn't got a great deal of hope of being mobilized to reach that elusive character, the general reader. And I do want to insist that that's a problem, because my underlying argument is one that many informed citizens regard as compelling. The argument that history is written anew for each generation, for each community, by scholars, but also by journalists and polemicists and other kinds of writers whose biases shape their narrative. It's not invented, but it's researched and written with new questions in mind. As I was drafting this lecture back in August, the media was full of articles about statues in the United States being removed or destroyed. And academic Twitter, which I must admit I waste too much time on, academic Twitter was full of jokes about how absurd it is to imagine that a statue can somehow embody history. But that absurd premise was being reiterated in very high places indeed, and across a broad political spectrum. So scholars should be taking this misunderstanding of materiality embodying a fixed history very seriously indeed. Now might be a good time to demonstrate, in a simple and straightforward way, that history books are as unstable as statues, with authors, readers, and publishers serving as the agents of changing interpretations. School histories may be easier to use for this purpose than research monographs or works of reference, because they are one kind of book with which almost everyone is somehow familiar. In many parts of the world, children are confronted in the classroom at an early age with an account of the history of their own country. For some of them, of course, it's a burden, and they embellish the book with the graffiti born out of boredom. For others, it's a joy and the entree to a lifetime of studying history and many more books, and eventually perhaps to writing their own. Although the books themselves, little school history books, get cast aside, tattered, superseded, not much studied, seldom collected or curated, the study of history in childhood provides an invisible scaffolding of knowledge and belief about one's personal identity in local and global context. Recently, there have been controversies over who controls the content of school history and thus the power to revise them. In Texas, as the largest market in the United States, in Japan, and elsewhere. In Canada, where we're struggling to confront our nation's troubled colonial relationships with the First Nations, or Native peoples, one of the threads of controversy is whether and how to begin telling uncomfortable stories to children whose parents may have learned anodyne tales of discovery, where European settlement was celebrated rather than interrogated. Most national histories are sites of controversy and revision, and it's in school textbooks where the chosen narrative is embedded. Those books have authors and editors and school board officials who act as a kind of quasi-editor. They have publishers who may find markets for their products beyond the reach of the commissioning authorities. And they have readers, children who, of course, are not in a position to detect errors and omissions. And then teachers are a kind of meta-reader who determine which chapters get studied, which pages get read, which exercises get assigned, and which topics are privileged in the classroom. Parents, of course, sometimes get involved too. Professional historians may or may not play a role. The politics of pedagogical historiography get complicated, and one book might end up being extremely influential. I want to spend the next few minutes focusing a bit more tightly on my own research and telling you about one book on the history of England that morphed into several different forms for rather different audiences, but which nevertheless developed an identity that made it unmistakable. I hope to tell the story lightly, without much documentation, in a way that might resonate with readers who are seeking to understand the conversations about history, heritage, the past, and who owns it that are circulating in the media nowadays. Victorian Britain, at the height of empire in the second half of the 19th century, two things were changing simultaneously. One was the nature of the book, and the other was the way that people were thinking about history. Books and periodicals had become affordable, at last, for ordinary working people. Paper and printing were cheaper, the taxes on knowledge had been repealed, and publishers had changed their business model to think in terms of selling a lot of product at low prices, rather than keeping the quantities small and the prices high. History, meanwhile, was becoming an academic discipline with its own research methodologies and a whole cadre of trained professionals, trained practitioners, rather than what it had been for centuries, a literary genre that told and retold the same familiar stories with rhetorical flourishes and shiny new additions taking the place of archival research. Now, of course, I just oversimplified both of those changes to the point of caricature, but I hope you get my drift. Neither of these changes came easily. My story is about two people, each at the center of one of them, the publisher Alexander Macmillan and the historian John Richard Green. Macmillan had a knack for finding successful authors, nurturing them, and then marketing their books to an eager readership. He did this with a wide range of genres, both literary and material, novels, poetry, philosophy, and science, in periodicals as well as in books. Green had a talent for friendship and collaboration, as well as a wonderful knack for writing a powerful and readable narrative. His friends were men who saw themselves as the serious historians, rigorous, scholarly, basing their arguments on documentary sources and deploying those arguments to build reliable accounts that could form the basis for public policy, as well as standing alone as research for its own sake. But unlike many of them, Green was vividly aware of the literary marketplace. Other historians, people like E.A. Freeman and A.W. Ward, who will come into the story I'm about to tell, kind of disdained the marketplace and preferred to write as specialists, for specialists. But they still respected Johnny Green, as many of them called him. Beginning about the 1860s, there was a lot of interest in producing new accounts of the history of England. From the point of view of publishers like Macmillan, there was a market, or rather several markets. One was in schools, where boys and girls were expected to learn it in some detail. Another was for adult readers with an interest in the past. The existing books were not very satisfactory. Macmillan tried to tempt the author of Westward Ho to write a boy's history of England, quote unquote. But that very popular writer, who was the novelist and social reformer Charles Kingsley, had other commitments. Edward A. Freeman was more receptive, but his argumentative pedagogical style was not really conducive to the hybrid audience that Macmillan envisaged. Late in 1869, however, Green took the bait. He wrote to the publisher proposing a 600-page volume on the history of the English people, not the nation or the state or its monarchs, wars, and revolutions. This was a kind of social history 100 years before E.P. Thompson wrote The Making of the English Working Class and coined the term history from below. But it was also what we now call history with the politics left out, and hence appealing to a general audience and to school teachers. Right from the beginning, Green envisaged multiple markets for variations of the same basic text. He told Macmillan in his letter, quote, "The work would serve as a school manual for the higher forms and as a handbook for the universities, while in a more general issue, it might, I think, supply a want in our literature, that of a book in which the past lines of our history should be fixed with precision and which might serve as an introduction to its more detailed study." He continued, "The book would be itself a history of England, in which foreign wars and outer events would occupy a far more subordinate position than they generally do, and in which the main attention would be directed to the growth, political, social, religious, intellectual, of the people itself." Later, Green came to characterize his book in terms of what it was not. It was not a drum and trumpet history. It wasn't the history of the British Empire either, although, as we'll see, it did find many readers in the colonies. Macmillan offered a lucrative contract, and Green set to work on his history of the people of England for English-speaking readers everywhere. His colleagues among the more academically oriented historians were skeptical about writing for what one of them referred to as the impalpable general reader. But Green and Macmillan knew what they were doing. And right from the beginning, that included leaving room for variations on the text and for making use of the author's high profile by attaching him to other publishing projects, perhaps a periodical or a series of small histories of various nations, a school reader with excerpts from the larger book, a summary edition in a simplified style for schools, and so forth. They were not afraid to look to the American and colonial markets either. Once the book was accomplished, as they say, once it was in print under the title A Short History of the English People, there were renewed conversations about the market. Although the book had been designed to signal its suitability for upper-level school children, Macmillan thought it, quote, "quite possible that your book," he's writing to Green, "quite possible that your book may be found, after all, just the sort of thing that higher masters and university teachers may prefer their students to read, getting up the detail from your tables and their previous reading." Both Green and Macmillan thought it was, quote, "well suited for that somewhat vague entity, the general reader. But alas," Macmillan continued, "the form won't quite suit him. It looks a school book, and oh, our somewhat vague friend, the general reader, our somewhat vague friend is rather stupid and goes by appearance. Still, we must do our best." Their best included a tentative plan for Green to write a slighter book on the same subject, aimed at intermediate-level pupils. However, they decided to wait and see if the full-fledged work would prove a success when tried in the classroom. So it did. 6 months later, the 847-page book was flying off the shelves, and the two collaborators were discussing a school edition, of which 1,000 of a total of 8,000 copies were destined for the United States, as well as a library edition. "I hope," Macmillan told Green, said to him generously, "I hope you will reap a big harvest from this book." They also put together a volume of Readings from English History, edited by Green, with selected passages from various historians, including himself. In addition, there was a substantial new book, A History of the English People, so not short, in 4 volumes, published between 1877 and 1880. And then, a more troubling kind of evidence of Green's popularity came from India in 1880, a letter to Macmillan from another of his authors, reporting that, quote, the enterprising babus of Calcutta are pirating your Green's readings like fun. Pirating, of course, refers to plagiarism or unauthorized reprinting, and a babu was a pejorative term for a native person in India with a shaky command of English. The author of the letter enclosed an advertisement for a volume advertised as a key to the readings, but which actually contained the text also very fully. So you wouldn't have to buy Macmillan's book, you could buy this other version. And he reported that he had seen others. The colleague also recommended that Macmillan authorize the publication of his own key to Green's volume, rather than allow pirate publishers to reap the profits. By 1884, the short history had been out for a decade, and Green himself had been dead for a year. His widow, Alice Green, herself a distinguished historian of Ireland, carried on the correspondence with Macmillan, and together they kept the book alive. One question was whether it should be brought up to date, and if so, by whom. I won't go into a lot of details about that conversation. Fast forward to 1890, 16 years after the book was published, with several other histories of England available from competing publishers. An editor at Oxford University Press wrote rather ruefully to an Oxford historian, saying, quote, "The hold of Green's short history is so strong that it might not be possible for any history approaching it in scale to make way against it." By 1891, that hold amounted to 160,000 copies in print. In 1896, then there were probably more if you count the colonial and American editions. In 1896, 22 years after publication, the same Oxford editor told another Oxford historian, quote, "The average person only reads his English history in one form, and that with Green's book before him, he will read no other in the present generation." After 1892, the average person could also read the short history in a 4-volume illustrated edition, put together by Alice Green and Kate Norgate, a protege of his. Those 4 volumes could be acquired by installments. However, in this edition, in shilling parts with paper covers containing adverts, even for tobacco and nerve remedies. So a lot of variation in the way you could find this book, get this book into your hands. By 1906, historical research at the universities had made huge progress, and the Cambridge economic historian J.H. Clapham observed in a letter that Green's work had now we're talking after 3 decades, become discredited in academic circles, although he noted in his letter that Macmillan was still producing new editions, which they were. In 1911, with the copyright due to run out in 1916, a younger Macmillan urged Alice Green to compose an extra chapter in order to claim her own copyright, in a revised edition. The end of copyright allowed competing publisher Dent to create an Everyman's Library edition of the short history, although he had to pay a 10% royalty to Alice Green. Some 500,000 copies had been published by that time. The editions continued to roll out, and in 1918, this is 44 years and a world war after the first one, the historian A.W. Ward was advising the Cambridge University Press about their next moves with respect to historical works. Ward recognized that authorship was crucial for a popular work on the national history. He said, quote, "The work should be of metal thoroughly fused and written throughout in an effective and sympathetic style. Whoever it is, he should, as Green did, devote himself for some years to the task and make it part of his life. The sort of writer I have in mind is G.M. Trevelyan, in whose style there is life, and who I should think has much of the necessary learning. In any case," the historian advised the publisher, "I would not start the book till I were sure of the man." Now, if you know anything about popular histories of England, these were actually prophetic words. Macaulay, Green, Trevelyan, Arthur Bryant, Churchill, a succession of authors came to be recognized as the man with an effective and sympathetic style, reproduce the well-worn narrative in print. And they were succeeded on television by A.G.P. Taylor and later by Simon Schama and David Starkey. What was not so clearly recognized was that their authorship, the thoroughly fused metal of these men's texts, was nevertheless susceptible to being molded into different versions aimed at different audiences. In the academic historiography that flourished in the 1960s and 70s, a rigorously theorized social history, political, even Marxist, came to supplant the sort of history of the English people initiated by J.R. Green. But the people's history, written by E.P. Thompson and others, wonderful as it was, that people's history never attained the knowledge mobilization achieved by commercial publishers working closely with a succession of authors whose writing was geared to enthralling an audience rather than advancing an argument. Now, nobody reads Green now. And I'm not suggesting that anybody should. But by researching and thinking about Green and reading about Green and his best-selling book, we can demonstrate how history books get changed for commercial as well as for literary reasons. We can point out that many of those TV histories have print-based versions as well, and that a popular film or television series is likely to spawn a book version, and vice versa. Despite being based on facts and on events that actually happened, history books are remarkably fluid. And that, I think, is what makes them fodder for the scholarship of book historians. So, what I've been hoping to open up here is a conversation about how the history of the book, and in my particular case, the history of popular histories of England, how that can be mobilized for outreach to an uninitiated, non-academic audience. If I were a student of contemporary publishing, I might be talking about contemporary books and how school boards, politicians, and publishers are manipulating their messages about the past for good reasons and bad. But I think my account of what happened with Green's book tells a more nuanced story with a longer time scale. It demonstrates that a narrative as familiar as the history of England could be recast as being about the people and their literature and culture, rather than what Green disparaged as drum and trumpet history. Then a smart publisher like Alexander Macmillan could leverage the author's and the book's reputation to open up new markets in schools, for gifts, and for casual reading. The author's death need not stand in the way of producing illustrated editions or even of adding new chapters. Clever as the Macmillans were, though, they could not prevent pirated editions, pirated versions, and other unauthorized reprints from appearing. As we saw with the piracy of the enterprising babus of Calcutta, Green's readings in the history of England was finding an eager market in one of Britain's colonies. School boards and booksellers in Canada were also authorizing the short history. And perhaps, I haven't done this research yet, I don't know for sure, perhaps the same thing was happening in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The question I want to ask, and I know is unanswerable, at least in any direct way, is to what extent were attractively packaged histories of England, like Green's, actually making it difficult or impossible for writers in those colonial places to write their own histories of their own places and to find publishers and readers. Even histories by settler peoples were very slow to emerge in those colonies. And when they did come, they were modeled on histories of England. Furthermore, they were all too likely to suppress and distort the histories that native peoples sought to share. I'd like to investigate further the idea that histories of England, not just Green's, but his is a good example, had a hegemonic effect on writers, publishers, booksellers, librarians, and readers all over the world. Now, I won't say much in conclusion because I want to leave time for questions, But I do want to tie together what I said earlier about the essential lessons of book history, about instability or mutability, and about human agency, with what I've been saying about my research on history books. And perhaps the lesson here is that we book historians should be open to working with our publishers and other knowledge brokers towards casting our histories in more than one version and reaching out to different audiences. Because really, whether our discipline is in literature or librarianship or social science or history, and whether by the book we mean periodicals or tweets or any other form of material text, if we book historians can make the connection between our specialized knowledge of how books change and who makes them change, then we are mobilizing that specialized knowledge in the interests of critical reading and engaged citizenship. Thank you. Thank you very much.